In the fall of 1823, the small town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, recorded 17 unexplained deaths within just 3 months. What made these deaths particularly disturbing was not the number, but the fact that each of the victims had been prepared for burial by the same family funeral home. The Hartwell Funeral Home had served the community for over 2 decades, earning a reputation for meticulous care of the deceased and compassionate treatment of grieving families. However, when a traveling doctor noticed peculiar marks on several bodies during a routine health inspection, he uncovered evidence that would shake the foundations of this quiet Pennsylvania town. What authorities discovered in the basement of the Hartwell establishment was so horrifying that local officials buried the records for nearly a century, and some say the full truth was never told, before continuing with the story of the Hartwell family and their house of horrors. If you are fascinated by dark historical mysteries like this, be sure to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell. We bring you the most chilling true stories from America's past. Also, let us know in the comments which state or city you are listening from. We love hearing from our community of mystery lovers around the world, but let me take you back to rural Pennsylvania in 1823, where the Hartwell family had built what seemed to be a respectable business on a foundation of unimaginable darkness. Millbrook nestled in the hills of southeastern Pennsylvania, a community of just 300 souls who lived off farming, logging, and the occasional travelers who stopped at the town's only inn. The year 1823 marked a period of growth for the young American Republic. But small towns like Millbrook remained largely isolated from the bustling cities of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Here, neighbors knew each other's business, children played freely in the streets, and trust was the currency that kept the community together. The Hartwell family arrived in Millbrook in 1801, when Patriarch Ezekiel Hartwell purchased a large stone house on the outskirts of town and established the region's first dedicated funeral home. Before the Hartwells, families prepared their own dead or relied on the local carpenter to build coffins. Ezekiel's professional approach to caring for the dead was initially viewed with suspicion by some townsfolk, but his respectful manner and fair prices quickly won over the community. Ezekiel lived in the funeral home with his wife Martha, their 3 children, sons Josiah and Caleb, and daughter Rebecca, and Martha's elderly father, Thomas Creed. The family seemed to embody the Protestant work ethic that defined rural Pennsylvania. They attended Sunday services at the Methodist Church, participated in community barn raisings, and Martha was known for bringing pies to families in need. Josiah, the eldest son at 26, had learned the embalmer's trade from his father and was expected to inherit the business. Caleb, 23, assisted with carpentry and grave digging. Rebecca, just 19, helped her mother with household chores and often comforted grieving families with her gentle manner. The Hartwell establishment occupied a 3-story stone building with a wooden addition that housed the preparation rooms. The main floor served as both the family's living quarters and a viewing area for the deceased. A narrow staircase led to the 2nd floor, where the family's bedrooms were located, while another set of stairs descended into a basement that had been converted into an embalming and storage area. The property also included a large barn where coffins were built and a small cemetery plot for those who could not afford burial elsewhere. What made the Hartwells particularly trusted in the community was their willingness to serve families, regardless of their ability to pay. During harsh winters, when crops failed, they often provided services in exchange for food or future work. This generosity created a network of grateful families throughout the region, and word of their compassionate service spread to neighboring towns. By 1823, the Hartwell Funeral Home was handling nearly all the deaths within a 24-kilometer radius. The political climate of Pennsylvania in 1823 was marked by tensions between traditional rural values and the growing influence of industrial progress. The Erie Canal was nearing completion in New York, promising unprecedented economic opportunities for the region, but also threatening to disrupt the established order of small-town life. Religious revival movements swept through Pennsylvania communities, bringing both spiritual renewal and social upheaval as traditional structures of authority were questioned. In this climate of change and uncertainty, institutions like the Hartwell Funeral Home represented stability and continuity. However, beneath this facade of respectability, something sinister was taking root in the Hartwell household: the isolation of their work, the trust placed in them by grieving families, and the very nature of their profession created opportunities that most people could never imagine. Death had not only become their livelihood but their obsession, and the line between caring for the dead and creating them was about to be crossed in ways that would horrify anyone who discovered the truth. The first sign that something was wrong came on October 15, 1823, when Dr. Samuel Harrison arrived in Millbrook to conduct his annual health inspection of the neighboring towns. Dr. Harrison was a traveling physician employed by the state to monitor disease outbreaks and ensure that proper sanitary practices were being followed in rural communities. His visits were routine, usually involving examinations of water sources, food storage facilities, and burial practices. What caught Dr. Harrison's attention was not initially the number of recent deaths in Millbrook, but rather the unusual circumstances. He observed during his mandatory inspection of the Hartwell Funeral Home, Pennsylvania law required that all bodies be available for medical examination if requested by a state physician, a regulation that had been implemented after several cholera outbreaks in the previous decade. When Dr. Harrison arrived at the Hartwell establishment that crisp autumn morning, he was warmly greeted by Ezekiel Hartwell and his son Josiah. The two men guided him through their facilities, proudly displaying their modern embalming equipment and meticulously clean preparation rooms. Everything seemed in order until Dr. Harrison requested to examine 3 bodies that were currently in their care, being prepared for funeral services later that week. The first body belonged to Eleonora Fairchild, a 68-year-old widow who had allegedly died of consumption 3 days earlier. As Dr. Harrison conducted his examination, he noticed something that chilled his blood. Along Eleonora's neck, barely visible beneath the high collar of her burial dress, were faint but unmistakable bruise marks. The pattern was consistent with manual strangulation, not the debilitating disease that was supposed to have taken her life. When Dr. Harrison questioned the marks, Josiah Hartwell quickly explained that they had awkwardly positioned Eleonora during the embalming process, causing post-mortem bruising. The explanation seemed plausible enough, but something about Josiah's manner, a slight tremor in his voice, the way his eyes avoided direct contact made Dr. Harrison decide to examine the other 2 bodies more carefully. The second body was that of Marcus Webb, a healthy 42-year-old farmer who had allegedly suffered a heart attack while working in his fields. Dr. Harrison's examination revealed something even more disturbing. Small puncture wounds on Webb's arms and chest were precisely placed and far too deliberate to be accidental. When pressed for an explanation, Ezekiel Hartwell claimed that Webb had fallen onto some farming tools during his collapse, but the wounds were too clean and intentional for such a random accident. The third body provided the most damning evidence. Mary Peterson, a 26-year-old mother of 2, had allegedly died of fever after a brief illness. However, Dr. Harrison discovered traces of a white powdery residue around her mouth and fingernails. His medical training immediately recognized the substance as arsenic, a poison that was, unfortunately, common in rural areas where it was used to control rodent populations. As Dr. Harrison documented his findings, he noticed an oppressive atmosphere within the Hartwell establishment. Family members exchanged meaningful glances. Their previously warm reception had been replaced by a watchful chill. Martha Hartwell, who had been preparing tea in the kitchen, appeared in the doorway with an expression that could only be described as predatory. Even young Rebecca, who had seemed so innocent, watched the proceedings with eyes that held a knowledge Far beyond her years, the preparation room in the basement, which Dr. Harrison insisted on examining more thoroughly, revealed additional disturbing details. Along one wall were several large glass jars filled with various chemical solutions, some containing what appeared to be preserved human organs for unknown purposes. When questioned about these specimens, Ezekiel claimed they were for educational purposes to better understand the diseases that claimed the lives of their clients. But the organs seemed fresh, and some had been sectioned with a surgical precision that seemed unnecessary for simple preservation. Most unsettling of all was a leather-bound journal that Dr. Harrison noticed partially hidden beneath a pile of burial clothes. Before he could examine it more closely, Caleb Hartwell quickly moved to block his view, claiming that it contained private family records. But in the brief glimpse that Dr. Harrison caught, he saw that it appeared to be detailed notes about various individuals in the community, including information about their health, their family situations, and their financial circumstances. By the end of the examination, Dr. Harrison found himself in a difficult position. His medical training told him that at least 3 of the recent deaths showed signs of foul play, but his evidence was circumstantial, and the Hartwell family was respected throughout the community. Moreover, as an outsider conducting a routine inspection, his accusations would be met with skepticism by local authorities who had known and trusted the Hartwells for over 2 decades. That night, as Dr. Harrison prepared his preliminary report at the Millbrook Inn, he was approached by several townspeople who had heard about his visit to the funeral home. Their conversations revealed a pattern that chilled his blood. In hushed tones, they spoke of the unusual number of recent deaths, of how healthy individuals seemed to sicken and die suddenly within days, and of the almost eager manner in which the Hartwell family responded to news of someone's declining health. One particularly disturbing account came from Sarah Pitton, whose elderly mother had died just 2 weeks earlier. Sarah confided that her mother had been in good health and spirits until Martha Hartwell began visiting her regularly, bringing homemade soup and offering comfort during a mild bout of joint pain. Within 3 days of these visits, the elderly woman had taken violently ill and died before a doctor could be called. The Hartwell family had immediately offered their services, waiving their usual fee out of apparent compassion. Dr. Harrison's disturbing discoveries in Millbrook were not the first time questions had been raised about the Hartwell family's practices. Although previous concerns had been dismissed or forgotten by a trusting community, as he delved deeper into the family's history, a pattern of suspicious deaths began to emerge that stretched back to their arrival in Pennsylvania more than 2 decades earlier. The Hartwells had come to Millbrook from West Virginia in 1801, claiming that Ezekiel had learned the funeral trade from an uncle in Richmond. They had purchased their property from the estate of a recently deceased landowner, paying in gold coins that seemed unusually abundant for a family claiming modest means. Local records from that time showed that their first winter in Millbrook had been marked by an outbreak of what was described as a wasting disease that claimed 8 lives, all of which were prepared for burial by the newly established Hartwell funeral home. Over the years, townspeople occasionally remarked on certain peculiarities surrounding the deaths that occurred when the Hartwells were involved. Families would later comment on how quickly their loved ones seemed to waste away once the Hartwells began offering assistance, how eager the family was to handle all the arrangements, and how they discouraged second medical opinions or delays in burial. But in a close-knit community where the Hartwells had proven themselves to be generous and caring, such observations were dismissed as the natural suspicions that sometimes accompany grief. The basement of the Hartwell establishment held secrets that would have horrified the community if they had been discovered. Behind a false wall that Dr. Harrison had not detected during his inspection, the family maintained what could only be described as a death laboratory. Shelves lined with various poisons, surgical instruments far more sophisticated than any funeral preparation required, and detailed anatomical drawings suggested experiments that went far beyond the simple care of the deceased, most damning of all was the complete version of the journal that Dr. Harrison had glimpsed. This leather-bound tome contained meticulous records of every person who had died under their care, along with detailed observations about the effectiveness of various methods and substances. The entries, written by various hands over many years, revealed a systematic approach to murder that had been refined through practice and careful observation. The journal documented not only the methods of murder but also the careful selection of victims. The Hartwells had developed a sophisticated understanding of their community, identifying individuals whose deaths would be mourned but not extensively investigated. Elderly people with few relatives, individuals with pre-existing health problems, and those who had fallen on hard times were preferred targets. The family had also learned to space out their activities, ensuring that no pattern was obvious too. Casual observation, one particularly chilling entry, written in Josiah's careful handwriting, described the murder of Marcus Webb in clinical detail. Webb had been selected because he was a widower with no close family and because his farm bordered the Hartwell property, making it convenient for the disposal of evidence. The entry noted that Webb had been lured to the funeral home under the pretext of discussing the purchase of a casket for a recently deceased neighbor. Once there, he had been overpowered and subjected to what the journal euphemistically called experimental procedures before being killed and his body staged to suggest a heart attack. The family's motivations seemed to be a complex mix of financial gain, psychological satisfaction, and what could only be described as scientific curiosity about death and dying. They regularly stole money and valuables from their victims, but this seemed secondary to their apparent fascination with the process of causing and observing death. Several journal entries discussed their experiments with different poisons, their observations of how various individuals reacted to fear and pain, and their attempts to perfect methods that left no obvious evidence of foul play. Martha Hartwell emerged from the journal entries as perhaps the most cunning member of the family. Her specialty was befriending isolated or vulnerable members of the community, gradually gaining their trust before introducing poisons into the food or drink she prepared for them. Her matronly appearance and reputation for kindness made her the perfect predator, able to approach potential victims without arousing suspicion. The children were gradually initiated into the family's activities as they matured. Rebecca, despite her youth and innocent appearance, became skilled at identifying potential victims during social gatherings, reporting to the family about individuals who seemed lonely, ill, or in financial distress. Both sons developed expertise in the physical aspects of murder, learning to overpower victims and stage crime scenes to avoid detection. What made the Hartwell operation particularly sinister was its integration into the social fabric of the community. They attended church services, participated in town meetings, and maintained friendships with many of the same people they were systematically murdering. This dual existence required a level of psychological compartmentalization that suggested either inherent psychopathy or a gradual descent into madness that had consumed the entire family. The autumn of 1823 marked an escalation in their activities, driven both by opportunity and growing confidence. The previous winter had been harsh, leaving many families in financial distress and vulnerable to the Hartwells' offers of assistance. At the same time, the family's success in avoiding detection had made them increasingly bold, leading to the accelerated timeline that had finally attracted Dr. Harrison's attention. Dr. Harrison faced a dilemma that would test both his professional integrity and his personal courage. His medical examination had revealed clear evidence of foul play, but presenting his findings to local authorities would require him to accuse a respected family of systematic murder, a charge that would seem incredible to a community that had trusted the Hartwells for over 2 decades. Moreover, Dr. Harrison was scheduled to continue his inspection tour of neighboring towns within days, and delaying his departure would require explanations that he was not prepared to give. The solution came from an unexpected source. On his second night in Millbrook, Dr. Harrison was approached by Thomas Creed, Martha Hartwell's elderly father, who requested a private medical consultation. The old man claimed to be suffering from severe stomach pains and asked Dr. Harrison to examine him away from the funeral home. They met in the stable behind the inn, where Creed's demeanor immediately transformed from that of a frail patient to something far more calculating. "Doctor," Creed whispered, his eyes darting nervously toward the street, "I know what you found during your examination today. The marks, the poison, the wounds that don't match the alleged causes of death. You are right to be suspicious, but you do not understand the full extent of what is happening in that house." What Thomas Creed revealed to Dr. Harrison over the next hour painted a picture of evil that exceeded even the doctor's growing suspicions. Creed explained that he had been gradually poisoned by his own family over the past several months, experiencing the same symptoms that had preceded the deaths of several recent victims. His advanced age and declining health had made him an ideal test subject for the family's experiments, but his survival instinct and knowledge of their methods had allowed him to identify and counteract their attempts on his life. According to Creed, the family's activities had begun as simple grave robberies. Shortly after their arrival in Millbrook, Ezekiel had discovered that newly buried bodies could be exhumed and stripped of valuable jewelry, gold teeth, and burial clothes that could be resold in distant communities. This initial criminal activity had gradually evolved into something far more sinister as the family realized they could increase their profits by creating their own supply of bodies. The turning point had come in 1807 when the family had accidentally caused the death of a gravely ill man they were attempting to rob. Rather than face exposure, they covered up the crime and found that the death of their victim was readily accepted by the community as a natural progression of his illness. This success led to increasingly bold experiments in murder, with each family member developing specialized skills and roles in their expanding operation. Creed revealed that the basement laboratory contained detailed records of more than 40 murders committed over the past 16 years, with victims carefully selected from across the region to avoid detection. The family had developed a network of contacts in neighboring towns who alerted them to potential targets: isolated individuals, travelers, or anyone whose disappearance might not be immediately investigated. What made Creed's testimony particularly credible was his intimate knowledge of the family's methods and his ability to provide specific details about recent victims that Dr. Harrison had examined. He described exactly how Eleonora Fairchild had been strangled, how Marcus Webb had been tortured before his death, and how Mary Peterson had been gradually poisoned over several weeks while Martha pretended to care for her during a fictitious illness. The old man also revealed the existence of a mass grave hidden in the woods behind the Hartwell property, where the family disposed of victims whose bodies could not be passed off as natural deaths. This burial site contained the remains of at least a dozen individuals, including several travelers who had stopped at the funeral home seeking directions or shelter and were never seen again. Creed's motivation for betraying his family was both personal and practical. He had become increasingly horrified by their activities, but more importantly, he realized that his own death was imminent. The family had grown tired of supporting him, and recent conversations had made it clear that his usefulness as a test subject was coming to an end. His only hope for survival was to expose their crimes and seek protection from the authorities. The old man proposed a plan that would allow Dr. Harrison to gather irrefutable evidence while protecting both of them from immediate retaliation. Creed would provide the doctor with the key to the basement laboratory, allowing him to examine the hidden records and evidence during the family's absence at Sunday church services. This would give Dr. Harrison the documentation he needed to convince the authorities, while Creed would use the same opportunity to escape to the home of a distant relative in Philadelphia. Dr. Harrison spent the rest of the night wrestling with the implications of Creed's revelations. The magnitude of the crimes was staggering, involving dozens of murders committed over nearly 2 decades by a family that was trusted and respected throughout the community. The evidence promised by Creed would likely be sufficient to secure convictions, but it would also destroy the faith and security of hundreds of innocent people who believed themselves to be safe in their small town. More troubling still was the realization that Dr. Harrison himself was now in danger. His examination of the bodies had clearly aroused the family's suspicions, and his continued presence in Millbrook posed a threat to their operation. Creed warned that the family had killed to protect their secrets before and would not hesitate to do so again if they felt cornered. The plan they devised required precise timing and considerable courage. Dr. Harrison would need to gain access to the basement laboratory, document the evidence he found there, and escape from Millbrook before the family realized what had occurred. Meanwhile, Creed would disappear during the same period, making it appear as though he had simply wandered off in his senile confusion, a disappearance that would be tragic but not immediately suspicious. Sunday morning dawned gray and cold, with the November chill seeming to penetrate the bones of Millbrook's residents as they prepared for their weekly church services. Dr. Harrison had spent a sleepless night at the inn, alternately reviewing his medical notes and questioning the sanity of the plan he had agreed to undertake. The weight of the potential evidence hidden in the Hartwell basement pressed on his mind like a physical burden, compounded by the knowledge that his own life was now at stake. Thomas Creed had provided him with detailed instructions for accessing the basement laboratory during the family's absence at church. As prominent members of the Methodist congregation, the Hartwells never missed Sunday services and usually remained for social activities that extended into the afternoon. This would give Dr. Harrison approximately 3 hours to locate and document the evidence that Creed had described. The key that Creed had given him was small and ornate, designed to open a hidden compartment behind the stone wall of the basement. According to the old man, this compartment contained not only the complete journal of murders but also specimen jars, poison supplies, and detailed anatomical drawings that would provide irrefutable proof of the family's crimes. Most importantly, it contained a detailed map showing the location of the hidden cemetery where dozens of victims had been disposed of over the years. As the church bells began to ring in Millbrook, Dr. Harrison positioned himself in the woods behind the Hartwell property, watching as the family emerged from their home dressed in their Sunday best. Ezekiel wore a black suit that gave him a dignified, almost ministerial appearance, while Martha had chosen a dark blue dress with a white collar that emphasized her matronly respectability. Josiah and Caleb flanked their parents, looking like devoted sons, while Rebecca walked modestly beside her mother, her innocent appearance masking the calculating mind that Creed had described. What Dr. Harrison found most disturbing was how normal the family appeared as they made their way to church. Their faces showed no trace of the evil that Creed had described, no hint that they had murdered dozens of innocent people over the past 2 decades. They exchanged pleasantries with neighbors along the way, smiled at children playing in the yards, and presented themselves as the very model of Christian virtue and family values. The doctor waited a full 30 minutes after the family's departure before approaching the funeral home. The building stood silent and imposing in the weak autumn sunlight, its stone walls guarding secrets that would shock the entire community if they were revealed. Dr. Harrison's hands trembled slightly as he used Thomas Creed's key to enter through the basement door. But his medical training had prepared him to confront disturbing realities, and he forced himself to proceed methodically. The basement initially appeared exactly as it had during his official inspection: clean, organized, and professionally maintained. The embalming tables were spotless, the chemical solutions properly labeled and stored, and the few bodies currently in their care lay peacefully beneath white sheets. It was only when Dr. Harrison began to examine the walls more closely that he located the hidden entrance Creed had described. Behind a section of the stone wall that appeared identical to the rest of the basement, the small key opened a concealed panel that revealed a chamber of horrors beyond his worst imaginings. The secret room was larger than the main basement, extending beneath the hillside beyond. Shelves lined the walls, containing hundreds of glass jars filled with preserved human organs, each carefully labeled with dates and what appeared to be experimental notes. The murder journal occupied a place of honor on a wooden lectern in the center of the room. The leather-bound volume was thick, with years of entries written by various hands but with a consistent attention to detail that spoke of scientific methodology applied to the act of murder. Dr. Harrison's medical training allowed him to understand the technical aspects of what he was reading, but the clinical precision with which the family had documented their crimes was perhaps more horrifying than the murders themselves. Each entry followed a similar format: identification of the victim, method of approach, technique employed to kill, observations about the victim's reactions, and notes for future reference. The entries revealed a progression from simple poisonings to increasingly sophisticated methods that suggested years of practice and refinement. Recent entries showed experiments with various surgical techniques apparently performed on living victims to study their effects. What shocked Dr. Harrison the most was the discovery that the family's activities extended far beyond Millbrook. The journal documented murders in at least 6 different Pennsylvania towns, with victims selected during the family's travels to provide funeral services to distant clients. They had developed a system for identifying vulnerable individuals in each community, often returning months later to commit crimes in areas where they were less likely to be suspected. The anatomical drawings were even more disturbing than the journal entries. Detailed illustrations showed the progression of various experimental procedures, with careful notes on which techniques produced the most fear in the victims and which methods were most effective for different types of people. The drawings suggested that the family viewed their victims not as human beings but as subjects for scientific study, approaching murder with the same methodical precision that legitimate researchers might apply to animal specimens. As Dr. Harrison continued his examination of the hidden chamber, he became aware of voices outside the building. Glancing at his pocket watch, he realized with growing alarm that he had spent more than 2 hours in the basement, absorbed in documenting the evidence he had discovered. The voices grew louder, and he recognized the distinctive cadence of Ezekiel Hartwell's speech as the family returned from church far earlier than expected. Panic seized Dr. Harrison as he realized his precarious situation. He was trapped in the secret chamber with damning evidence of the family's crimes, and they would surely kill him if they discovered his presence. The voices drew closer to the building, and he could hear footsteps on the wooden porch above his head. His escape route through the basement door would take him directly into their path, but remaining hidden in the chamber would only delay his discovery until they came to check on their secrets, just as it seemed that Dr. Harrison's investigation might expose the terrible truth about the Hartwell family. The situation takes a deadly turn. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Click the like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's find out together what happens next in this house of horrors. In his desperate search for an alternative escape route, Dr. Harrison noticed that the secret chamber extended further than he had initially realized. At the back of the room, partially hidden behind stacks of specimen jars, was another door that seemed to lead deeper into the hillside. With the family's voices growing closer, he had no choice but to risk exploring this unknown passage, hoping that it would lead to freedom rather than deeper into the nightmare he had uncovered. The narrow passage behind the specimen chamber led Dr. Harrison through a hand-dug tunnel that extended deep into the hillside behind the Hartwell property. The walls were of rough-hewn stone, carved with simple tools but showing evidence of years of gradual expansion. As he moved through the tunnel by the light of a candle he had found in the chamber, the doctor began to understand the true extent of the Hartwell family's operation. The tunnel opened into a natural cavern that had been converted into what could only be described as an ossuary. Human remains were scattered throughout the cavern, some carefully arranged on stone shelves, others simply piled in corners where they had been hastily discarded. The smell of death and decomposition was overpowering, but Dr. Harrison's medical training allowed him to examine the scene with professional detachment. Despite his horror, what he discovered in that underground cemetery revealed the full extent of the family's crimes. The remains of at least 40 individuals were present in various states of decomposition, representing decades of systematic murder. Some of the bodies showed evidence of the experimental procedures documented in the journal, while others appeared to have been killed quickly and efficiently. Personal belongings scattered among the remains, jewelry, clothing, coins suggested that robbery had indeed been a significant motivation for many of the murders. Most disturbing of all was a section of the cavern where recent victims had been displayed almost as trophies. Dr. Harrison recognized clothing and jewelry belonging to several individuals he had examined during his official inspection, confirming that the Hartwells had been systematically murdering their clients rather than simply preparing natural deaths for burial. The clinical arrangement of these bodies suggested that the family visited this underground chamber regularly, perhaps to relive their crimes or to continue their grotesque experiments. As Dr. Harrison documented what he found in the cavern, he heard voices echoing through the tunnel behind him. The Hartwells had discovered his absence from the inn and, apparently, had found evidence of his intrusion into their secret chamber. Several voices called his name, but the tone was not one of concern. It was the patient, predatory sound of hunters tracking cornered prey. The cave system proved to have several exits, and Dr. Harrison managed to escape through a narrow opening that led to the wooded hillside above the Hartwell property. From this vantage point, he could see the family searching the area around their home, moving with the practical efficiency of people who had done such searches before. It was clear that Dr. Harrison was not the first person to discover their secrets, and the methodical way they searched the area suggested that previous investigators had not survived their discoveries. Dr. Harrison's escape from Millbrook required all his wilderness survival skills and considerable luck. He was forced to abandon his belongings at the inn and travel cross-country toward the nearest substantial town, avoiding roads where the Hartwells might pursue him. His medical bag contained enough documentation to convince the authorities, but he needed to reach civilized areas before the family could silence him permanently. What Dr. Harrison did not know was that Thomas Creed had not escaped as planned. The old man had been discovered attempting to leave the house and was confronted by his family about his betrayal. Under torture, Creed had revealed everything about his agreement with Dr. Harrison, including the doctor's plans to document their crimes and expose them to the authorities. This revelation had led the family to return early from church and begin their search for Dr. Harrison. More ominously, it had convinced them that their operation in Millbrook was no longer sustainable. Rather than simply eliminating Dr. Harrison and continuing their activities, they decided to abandon their established base and move to a new community where they could start over. The Hartwells' departure from Millbrook was as carefully planned as their crimes. They claimed that Ezekiel had received an urgent message about a dying relative in Ohio, requiring an immediate trip that might keep them away for several months. The funeral home would be temporarily closed, and they asked neighbors to look after their property during their absence. To most of the community, this seemed like a reasonable family emergency that warranted their sympathy and support. What the townspeople did not realize was that the Hartwells were methodically destroying evidence of their crimes before they left. The secret chamber was emptied and sealed. The cave system was partially collapsed to hide the remains it contained, and all documentary evidence of their activities was destroyed or packed for transport to their new location when Dr. Harrison reached the authorities in Philadelphia 3 days later. The Hartwell family had completely disappeared, leaving behind only an empty funeral home and a community that would never suspect the horrors that had been committed in their midst. Dr. Harrison's account of what he had discovered was met with skepticism by the Philadelphia authorities, who found it difficult to believe that a respected family could have committed such extensive crimes without being detected. The doctor's evidence was compelling, but much of it had been destroyed or hidden by the time investigators arrived in Millbrook. The few remains they were able to recover from the partially collapsed cave system were insufficient to support the full extent of Dr. Harrison's accusations. The subsequent investigation was hampered by the community's resistance to believing such terrible things about the Hartwell family. Townspeople provided character references for the Hartwells, insisting that they had been kind and caring neighbors who could never have committed the crimes that Dr. Harrison described. Without the family present to question, and with most of the physical evidence destroyed, the authorities were forced to conclude that, while there were suspicious circumstances, there was not enough proof to justify a manhunt. Thomas Creed's disappearance was explained by the family as that of a senile old man who had wandered off into the woods in confusion. Search parties found no trace of him, and his fate officially remained unknown, although Dr. Harrison had no doubt that Creed had paid the ultimate price for his attempt to expose his family's crimes. The aftermath of Dr. Harrison's discoveries haunted both him and the Millbrook community for years. The doctor submitted detailed reports to state authorities, but without the Hartwell family present to question and with most of the physical evidence destroyed, the case was eventually classified as inconclusive and filed away in the growing bureaucracy of the Pennsylvania state government. Dr. Harrison never stopped believing in what he had witnessed, and he spent considerable personal resources trying to track down the Hartwell family. His investigations revealed patterns of suspicious disappearances and deaths in various Ohio communities during 1824 and 1825, but by the time he was able to alert authorities in those areas, the family had again vanished. Over the next decade, Dr. Harrison documented similar patterns in Indiana, Illinois, and eventually the Missouri Territory, always arriving too late to prevent further murders or capture the perpetrators. The people of Millbrook were left to grapple with the possibility that they had lived alongside systematic killers for over 2 decades. Some residents refused to believe Dr. Harrison's account, insisting that the Hartwells had been good neighbors who were being falsely accused. Others began to re-examine past deaths with new suspicion, wondering how many of their friends and relatives had been murdered rather than claimed by natural causes. The Hartwell funeral home building remained empty for nearly 10 years before being purchased by a Philadelphia merchant who converted it into a general store. Local residents were reluctant to enter the building, and it took years for the community to fully accept its new function. The basement was permanently sealed, and no one showed any interest in exploring the cave system that Dr. Harrison had described. Perhaps most tragically, the fear and suspicion created by the Hartwell case fundamentally changed the character of Millbrook. The trust and openness that had defined the community for generations were replaced by wariness and doubt. Neighbors began to view each other with suspicion. Death became a source of fear rather than acceptance, and the simple faith that had bound the community together was permanently fractured. Dr. Harrison continued his work as a traveling physician, but he was forever changed by what he had witnessed in Millbrook. He developed an almost obsessive attention to detail during his inspections, examining each death with the thoroughness of a criminal investigator rather than a routine health official. His colleagues began to view him as eccentric, even paranoid. But Dr. Harrison knew that evil could hide behind the most respectable facades. In 1847, nearly 24 years after his experience in Millbrook, Dr. Harrison received a letter that would vindicate his long-held beliefs and provide a chilling final chapter to the Hartwell story. The letter came from a sheriff in the Oregon Territory, where westward expansion had brought thousands of settlers seeking new opportunities on the frontiers of America. According to the sheriff's account, a family named Caldwell had operated a funeral home in a small Oregon settlement for 3 years before being exposed under circumstances remarkably similar to those that Dr. Harrison had uncovered in Pennsylvania. The sheriff had read Dr. Harrison's old reports in federal archives and recognized the identical patterns of suspicious deaths, systematic poisoning, and hidden burial sites. When authorities finally raided the Caldwell establishment, they found evidence of at least 30 murders committed during their 3 years in Oregon. But more significantly, they discovered documentation proving that the Caldwells were, in fact, the Hartwell family, who had been moving westward across America for more than 2 decades, establishing new identities and continuing their murderous practices in each new community. The family was captured alive, and during interrogation, they confessed to crimes spanning nearly 30 years and covering 8 different states. The total number of their victims exceeded 120 individuals, making them one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Ezekiel Hartwell, now calling himself Ezekiel Caldwell, was 73 years old but remained mentally sharp and showed no remorse for his crimes. Martha, Josiah, Caleb, and Rebecca had continued their roles in the family operation, refining their techniques and expanding their methods with each move. The family's confessions revealed the full extent of their crimes and provided closure for dozens of unsolved disappearances across the frontier. They described in detail how they had perfected their system of victim selection, establishing credibility in new communities, and disposing of evidence. Most chilling of all, they expressed pride in their accomplishments, seeing themselves as successful entrepreneurs who had simply chosen an unusual line of business. Ezekiel Hartwell was executed by hanging in Salem, Oregon in December 1847, followed by his wife Martha and son Josiah. Caleb was sentenced to life imprisonment, where he died of pneumonia in 1852. Rebecca, who was relatively young and claimed to have been coerced by her family, received a 20-year sentence but died in prison of unknown causes in 1851. The revelation of the true extent of the Hartwell family's crimes sent shockwaves through communities across America where they had operated. Families who had trusted them with their most vulnerable moments realized that they had been in the presence of calculating killers. The case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of placing blind trust in strangers, no matter how respectable they may seem. Dr. Harrison, now in his 70s, traveled to Oregon to witness Ezekiel Hartwell's execution and finally confront the man who had haunted his thoughts for more than 2 decades. The two men spoke briefly before the execution, and Hartwell expressed surprise that Dr. Harrison had survived his discovery in Millbrook, claiming that several other investigators over the years had not been so fortunate. In their final conversation, Hartwell revealed one last disturbing detail. The family had trained other individuals in their methods, apprentices who had established their own operations in various parts of the expanding nation. He claimed that at least 3 other families were continuing similar practices but refused to provide any details that might help authorities locate them. This revelation ensured that Dr. Harrison's remaining years would be spent with the knowledge that the evil he had uncovered in Millbrook was still spreading across America. The community of Millbrook never fully recovered from the revelation that their trusted neighbors were systematic murderers. The town gradually declined as families moved away, unable to bear the weight of their shared history. By 1860, Millbrook had been completely abandoned, and the forest began to reclaim the buildings where so much horror had been hidden. Today, few records remain of the Hartwell family's crimes. Official reports were buried in government archives. Newspaper accounts were forgotten, and the communities they terrorized tried to erase all memory of their presence. But for those who study the darker chapters of American history, the Hartwell case serves as a reminder that evil can flourish anywhere, hidden behind masks of respectability and protected by the very trust and innocence it seeks to destroy. The story of the Hartwell Funeral Home demonstrates how serial killers could operate with impunity in an era before modern communication and law enforcement coordination. It shows how predators could exploit the natural human trust that bound communities together, using that same trust as a weapon against their victims. Most importantly, it reveals how ordinary people, doctors, neighbors, family members sometimes, held the power to expose great evils, but only if they were willing to look beyond appearances and act on their suspicions. Dr. Harrison spent his final years documenting everything he had learned about the Hartwell case, hoping that his records might one day help other investigators recognize similar patterns of crime. He died in 1853, taking with him the intimate knowledge of one of America's most horrifying family criminal enterprises. His detailed notes were discovered among his papers and eventually found their way into federal archives, where they remain today as testimony to crimes that shocked even the investigators who uncovered them. The legacy of the Hartwell family extends beyond their immediate victims to encompass the fundamental changes they brought to each community they touched. They destroyed the sense of security that had allowed small towns to function as extended families, replacing trust with suspicion and innocence with wariness. In this way, their impact on American society extended far beyond the individuals they murdered, touching the very fabric of community life in the expanding nation. This mystery shows us how easily evil can disguise itself as respectability, and how the very institutions we trust to comfort us in our darkest hours can sometimes harbor our worst nightmares. What did you think of this story? Do you believe that everything has been revealed about the Hartwell family's crimes, or could there have been even darker secrets that died with them? Leave your comment below and let us know if you've heard similar stories from the history of your own region. If you enjoyed this story and want more historical horror stories like this, subscribe, click the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark mysteries. The past holds many secrets, and we will continue to explore them together. Until the next video.